All right. Welcome back, moviesmen. We're doing a new segment, which is new releases, just because we can't talk about movies enough. So we're going to be doing our deep dive on the other channel. We'll be doing new releases on this one moving forward. And the new release that we will be discussing today is Dune 2. Let me kick this off. Did you guys see that? Anyway, um, let me kick this off with just a very brief assessment from me and a disclaimer. Now, the disclaimers are I am not a fan of Dune. Chase knows this. I started reading the book, and it is one of maybe 4 books in my life that I didn't see through to the end. I usually finish books, even if I don't like it. It's almost like a matter of like stubbornness for me. I'm like, I've got to finish this book because my bookshelf to me is like my trophy case, and I don't want any like half earned trophies, you know? And so it was a really difficult decision for me to not finish the book, but I just couldn't do it. I couldn't handle the boredom. I couldn't. It was so boring. And this is a sci-fi novel written in like the 1950s, right, Chase? Give me a nod if that's accurate. In the 1950s. So give it a little bit of grace. You know, we didn't have like the instant stimulation, like, you know, Hunger Games and, Ready Player One, the kind of books that are just like rock 'em, sock 'em, entertain. So I tried to give it grace. I tried to be like, this is a slow burn. I got about halfway through and I'm just like, I keep having to reread pages. So that's all just to say, I'm not a fan of Dune in terms of like the hardcore fanboy, knowing all the lore and all the background. But when the movie came out, and I didn't see the 1980s version of the movie because everybody said it was crap. So when the new movie came out, I was like, I like movies. Maybe this will redeem Dune in my mind. And it didn't really. I watched the first Dune and I was like, that's a good movie. But did it drive me to go back to the books and to really dig deep and to really like revisit and try to finish that freaking thing? No, it did not. It was kind of like, in my opinion, a mid-tier, you know, sci-fi fantasy action movie. It was like, it was entertaining enough, but I wasn't giddy. Going into the theater, I was just like, let's see what this movie has to offer. Let's see if I can conceptualize all this lore when it's given to me in this format instead of a book format. And so again, not a fan, but I did like Dune 1, and I've got my qualms with Dune 2, which we'll get into, but just initial feedback, I saw it in IMAX and it was an experience. It was a spectacle. It was amazing. Just in terms of the visual, the audio, and we'll get into the story later, but the visual and the audio, whoo, sweet, 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 sweet. In IMAX, worth it. All right, Chase, in stark contrast to my disclaimer, you are a Dune fan. You do know the lore. You've read the books. You know the backstory of all these different characters. Give us a synopsis of what you think of Dune in general and the movie specifically.
So I'll caveat your praise with I've read 4 out of the like 16 books. I have the rest of them on my queue. I pressed pause mainly because I wanted them to finish the saga before I read. Because what happened was, so Frank Herbert wrote the like 4 or 5 books. And I just a quick clarification, was 65 was when Dune came out. And so he wrote like 4 or 5 books, and then he died, and he had mountains of notes and half-baked stories and like how everything tied in, just kind of sitting in his study. And then his son, Brian Herbert, partnered with Kevin J. Anderson, who's a sci-fi author. He wrote a bunch of Star Wars books in the 90s and early 2000s. And they started with, okay, let's write a prequel trilogy to Dune. So when you go into Dune, you have Leto Atreides as an adult. He's like the Duke of Kaladin, and it's like, okay, we have him as a starting reference, and so the prequel trilogy is his story growing up from a boy to the Duke, and then what happened is, so I read those 3 like my first year of college, and then I went on my mission, and I came back and I was like, let's do Dune. So I dove into Dune. Read Dune, and then I read that Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson were writing a book in between Dune and Dune Messiah. And I was like, okay, I don't want to read Dune Messiah if there's going to be more story. So I pressed pause, and then they've written another, like it was about another 10 books, and they've wrapped it up. So I'm like, okay, I have the whole collection now. I just need to finish going through the stories. And so that's kind of my framing going into it. So yeah, I know I was super connected with every single character that appeared on screen in Dune and Dune Part 2. I knew their backstory. I knew where they came from. I knew the training that they went through. Like, I knew all those ins and outs. And for me, yeah, Dune is a dense book. And I think I told you this when you were reading it. I'm like, I'm going off of the momentum of 3 books that were written in the 2000s with the modern vocabulary and the modern pacing and the capture your attention. I took that momentum and drove through Dune because it is dense. It is tough to get through. It is 1960s sci-fi. I will say I've been reading Isaac Asimov, the Foundation trilogy, and Dune is way better than Foundation. Isaac Asimov is even tougher to get through it. That is a brick wall. But yeah, so to your point, I was kind of the opposite. However, I will parallel your praise, your enjoyment of the movie. I too found immense pleasure in seeing what Frank Herbert wrote put onto a screen. So I'll pause there before we dive into a lot of the details.
And I would say again, because you saw the 1980s version of the movie, right? Wasn't it crap? Yeah.
Yeah. They were trying to do something and they just didn't have the technology to do it. And there's a lot of like jokes now about it. All right. It's kind of a cult classic with Patrick Stewart being Gunnar Halleck and him playing his little, it wasn't a banjo, it was like a mandolin or whatever. And that was kind of a joke. Even so in Dune Part 1, when Timothy Chalamet first kind of walks in and he goes, Gunnar, play us a tune. Like, that was kind of a joke. And then you see it played out in Dune Part 2. But like, it matched the character. That is the character. But in 1984 or whenever it was, they wanted to do something, but you didn't have the technology. It just kind of fell flat because they couldn't take that vision and put it on a screen. Whereas today they did.
I'm reminded of George Lucas, and maybe Alan and Justin can speak to this more intelligently, but it was either a rumor or maybe it was fact, where he said that he needed to wait to do the prequels until the technology was available to produce the Star Wars vision that he wanted. Total failure. Dune, on the other hand, not total failure, but just the CG of the prequels is just kind of gross. But Dune, on the other hand, I feel like with these latest iterations actually achieved that. They actually leveraged technology and modern day cinema to maximize the experience that I'm sure Frank Herbert originally intended. Alan, give us your initial thoughts of Dune, your experience with Dune and the movie.
And I just realized I didn't mute this in the beginning, so hopefully there wasn't any reverb there. My bad. So I was going to actually offer a counterpoint. You said they couldn't do what they wanted to in 1984. Counterpoint is Star Wars. Star Wars was the pinnacle of sci-fi on film in the 70s and 80s. And so to say that they couldn't have done it, I kind of disagree with that. I also saw the 1984 version of Dune, and I don't think it was a lack of their inability to take. They're very similar stories. I got a boy on a desert planet that's the reluctant hero, and then I mean that's Star Wars. Star Wars copied the Dune narrative to some extent, and so to say that you couldn't have done it in the 80s, I kind of disagree with, because Star Wars did it. George Lucas did it, and then he did it multiple times without the advanced technology of today. You're right. What he was saying about he couldn't do the prequel trilogy till the technology caught up and kind of flopped, kind of messed that up a little bit. But that's neither here nor there. I'll give a little bit. So my background is similar to Bo's. I'm not a fan of Dune. I don't care for it. I don't like it. I had a friend in high school. Justin might remember Brent Voigt. And he was he was a good sci-fi fanatic, and he's the one that that had me watch the first Dune movie. And I just remember watching it. I'm like, they have this whole really long, drawn out movie, and then they cram the end of it like in a montage, like the whole war, like everything that happened in that we just watched in Dune Part 2, they cram packed it into like a montage at the end. It was completely not satisfying. It was terrible. And he prepped me pretty well, actually. He's like, look, this isn't the greatest movie, and it's a little bit campy. But the world that it came from is really cool. And then he tried to give me the book. I've tried to read Dune twice. Once when Brent gave me the book in high school, and I was like, cool. And I got like 4 pages in. I was like, never mind. And then Chase, I'm pretty sure if I'm remembering this correctly, when Chase was going on his mission, he gave me his collection of Dune books. And he's like, hey, you should probably read some of these. And I was like, okay, I'll give this another go. And I made it. I didn't even make it halfway through. I know I didn't make it halfway through, but I made it further than I did the first time. And I can't get into it. Even just listening to Chase just now, I'm like, I have no idea who any of those characters are. Because part of my problem with Dune is that not only did Frank Herbert create like a really compelling story, I'll give him that, because the story is really compelling. But my problem is that he created an entire universe that's supposed to be familiar to my universe, but it's not. And including complete like religions, politics, world building. Like he creates all of this, and then I jump into Dune, and I'm supposed to understand it, and I don't, and then I don't care. And that's like my problem. That's my whole problem with Dune, is that I just can't. I can't wrap my mind around it, and mostly because, and now this like at like this point in my life. Like, I just don't care to invest into it anymore. Like, I got real life to get into. So that's probably my problem, is I should have just dug into it when I was younger, because then I would know all the intricacies and the different houses and the different people within the houses, but I don't.
Yeah, I'm very similar in that, and I think I even told Chase this before this discussion, even with just like my initial thoughts right out of the theater. I told him, I'm like, it's almost frustrating, because I think I'm a decently smart person just in the grand scheme of things, like on the scale of the entire population of the world. I feel like I'm above average in terms of intelligence. These movies make me feel stupid. I'm like, what am I missing? I feel like I'm missing something. I feel like I just can't. It's like, it's hard to grasp. And I'm like, I'm usually good at grasping things, and this movie makes it difficult to grasp. Chase, real quick, I want to hear. Well, yeah, Chase, go ahead.
I was gonna say, it is tough. I would say my pushback for a lot of people, and maybe it's because Dune starts kind of in the middle of a story. But I'm like, guys, you read Brandon Sanderson, the entire Cosmere, right? Like, it's all of these different pieces interconnected, interwoven, or it's supposed to be at some point, right? And you have Hoyd, and you have, right, who's planet whatever jumping. You have Game of Thrones. How many characters are in Game of Thrones, Bo? Like, and you follow all the houses and all the clans and all of the characters there. Anyways, I'm like, yeah, it's tough, but there are other current like stories that are also complicated and interwoven, and I mean, anyways, so I would say I think you need to go into it with the right frame of mind to make it work. And maybe that's what it is just a bad framing.
Yeah, and that's another thing I told you, Chase, in my initial feedback from the movie was essentially that. I'm like, I feel like this is a movie you got to work for. You got to work for it. You can't, it's not just going to hand you the story like Star Wars or like the typical archetypal hero's journey. Real quick, you mentioned Brandon Sanderson. We've got Justin here, who is a huge Brandon Sanderson fan. I was about to push back on you, but I want to hear Justin's analysis first. In the context of this conversation, is that a fair comparison, Justin? Do you think the Brandon Sanderson universe, and just for context, for anybody who doesn't know, he wrote like Mistborn and I'll let Justin speak to it. It's like one of the best fantasy novelists of all time, in my opinion. Brandon Sanderson's a pure genius. Justin's a super fan. He's read more Sanderson than I have. I just want to hear what your thoughts are, Justin, in this conversation.
Thank you for putting me on the spot to say, is Frank Herbert one of the pioneers of science fiction better than Sanderson? The problem is we are good at modern fiction, and Sanderson is the best he doesn't have maybe the best prose, but as far as approachability from 4 years old to 40 to 400 years old, Brandon Sanderson has a great knack of hitting a target audience, a broad target audience. Whereas if we were born in the 60s, I think his linguistics and the way he wrote would have appealed to us more. But it's kind of like reading Tolkien, like the first 50, 70 pages until you get to Aragorn, Strider. I just want to throw the book away and go, why, Alan, did you give me this stupid book? And so the same thing can be said with Dune. You have to know Bene Gesserit and Atreides and Harkonnen and who's this emperor and Spice and it's Arrakis and it's Dune and Dukes and you kind of know some of these phrases, but for the most part, it's all new pronouns that you're having to learn and backstory you have to learn on the fly. And I will say this, if you read Brandon Sanderson's first novel, Elantris, it is much like reading Dune for the first time because he has this whole new world and Brandon Sanderson even admits this. He said, I put too many new pronouns that it's just really hard for you to grasp all these new ideas. And so in his consecutive, when you read Mistborn, you're getting ash from the sky, but then it's a 1800s feel. And you're like, oh, I'm comfortable with this world. It's weird, it's different, but I don't have to stretch too far. And the problem with Dune was back then, it was very visionary and just completely immersive in a whole new universe. And when you're coming with a 1960s prose and a visionary experience, just like Isaac Asimov was great, 100 years ago, whenever it was written, that is the context. You're now taking Dune in the 80s was still, you didn't have a visionary like this director, Denis, starts with a V. I can't, it's French or something. But his vision for Dune, especially part one, the first time I watched it, I'm like, yep, this is why I don't get Dune. But then I watched it again, and a third time, I'm like, oh, okay. I watched the movie 2 or 3 times. Then I read the book. I'm like, oh, this is that. Oh, okay, this is seen. And I'm like looking at the movie with the extended version, like we would do with Lord of the Rings extended version. And then I looked through the book through that lens, already having the movie as a canvas. And then I was able to digest Dune.
Alan, we'll get to you in just a second. I just want to initially get or get Drew's initial feedback. We've been going into the lore, we've been going into the backstories, into the books, into the canon. Drew doesn't read books. I want to hear what a movieman, and I say that tongue in cheek. Drew listens to audiobooks, but ultimately, Drew, I would say, and I think you would agree with me, you are more of a moviesman than a booksman. And so despite everything that's been discussed so far, strictly as a movie's been, how do you feel about Dune? Dune, the first one, and Dune 2?
Yeah, you put me up right after Justin goes into 12 feet deep pool water, and I'm like, all right, let me give you a couple inches of of what the normal people are swimming in over here. And so I would like to take myself and represent the majority population of seeing this movie. So I first heard of it from Chase, and I think because I just didn't like Chase growing up, I had that thing where I just hated everything he liked. And he was so into it that I was like, oh, is it cool, Chase? Yeah, Dune sucks. Dune sucks. And I just kind of hung on to that for 25 years. And I had to write notes because I was thinking about these things. But so I knew nothing about Dune. I knew that it was a really boring book, and I knew that they made a really crappy version that I hadn't seen yet. But I was excited for Dune 1 because I was like, oh, cool, like Star Wars stabbed me right in the back hundreds of times. We can get into that in another podcast. But I was so thirsty for this new sci-fi world, and obviously it came after Game of Thrones, and I got really into Game of Thrones and learning all the houses, like Chase was saying. And so I was like, this should be fun. And then I watched the movie, and I mean, there's memes for days about how normal people heard the movie. And I was like, it sounds like English speaking. It sounds like somebody who doesn't know how to speak English but kind of is trying to. So like you just don't understand everything that they're saying, and it just is so unworldly. It sounds like every third word they stick their into war. They're like, oh, we're going to war with, and you're, huh? It's almost English. I know that the syllables were there. I just couldn't. Oh, silly boy, that was a little. I know it's that. That's how I felt the entire movie, and I'm like, I love Isaac. Oh, this is great. I'm like, you're my son, and you're all little. I'm like, I'm like, man, it's like he's trying to tell me something. I know it. And and then like at the end of the first movie, at the end of the first movie, I had the realization of, I was like, oh, I see what they're doing. They expect the 10 Dune fans on planet Earth to educate everybody else who doesn't even care about Dune. That's what they did with this movie. So I need to find somebody who knows Dune and have them explain it to me like I'm 5 years old. And so I went 2 years not understanding Dune because those people are hard to find. And even when you do find them on the internet, they also sound like speak underwater. It's so simple. It's so simple. You go to the and then the king is going to and I'm like, right. Now explain it again. Slower. The planet is going to, and so I give up. I gave up. But I was excited to see Dune 2 because of all the hype. I was actually going to skip it. I was like, Dune 2, Dune isn't my cup of tea. And then I followed suit with both. Before you saw it, is you just watched some YouTube recaps, and I was like, I know how this is going to go, but I'll give it a shot. And people have done a good job. So I watched a video, like a 15-minute recap video of the first Dune, and I set all my ducks in a row, and I'm like, perfect, I understand the storyline. And then I saw the second one, and you can tally up the total fans of Dune from 10 to 11, because I'm a huge fan now. I was like, this is what I've been wanting: the visual, the sound effects, the storyline making sense, and being congruent, and like not being so such a windy road that it's hard to follow. The second one was just concise, and it was just a movie for people who like movies, and then they took it to another level. And that was my initial reaction to Dune 1, Dune 2. So I'm a super fan now. I've got a long ways to go, I know, to catch up, but I'm committed. I see the vision.
You've got a lot of books to read. Drew, what was especially funny about what you just said? You kept saying that it sounded like words underwater, but because your internet connection is so bad, it literally sounded like you were underwater while making the underwater noises. It was incredible. That was perfect. I never thought that a bad internet connection could actually add value to the conversation, but it did. That was I can't wait for you to see the recording of this and appreciate it the way that the rest of us did. Oh my gosh. Alan, you wanted to say something a while back. I don't remember if it was in response to Chase or Justin, but take it away.
Yeah, we got to do these things in person. Like, I'm like over here laughing like so hard I'm crying. Like, Drew's response was just so on point. Luckily I wrote it down so I wouldn't forget. I think so. I think I've identified part of the problem with Dune, which is something that Brandon Sanderson does really well, which is when introducing a new world, let's say Mistborn, for example, you jump into a new world with a character that is also new to that world. Like, Vin doesn't understand the magic and the politics or anything, so you're discovering all of that with her. Star Wars does this really well. You don't know anything about that galactic universe and the Force and space wizards and laser swords and all that kind of stuff. So you jump into that with Luke Skywalker, who also doesn't know anything about it, and you get to follow him in that journey. You don't have that with Dune. You jump into Dune, and you're expected to kind of already know it all. And that's I think where it kind of gets a lot of people. And again, I think I probably would attribute this to the genre of like the sci-fi genre in the 60s. I'm not super familiar with all of that because I think sci-fi kind of really hit its stride in the 90s, and like in the aftermath of Star Wars and Star Trek, and then that's when people really started to get into sci-fi and develop culture and pop culture around it. And so I'm just not as familiar with it post pre that time frame. So I'm not sure if that's like a normal story trope that kind of should have existed, or if that's a relatively new thing in pop culture. But I think that's part of the problem why Dune is really hard to get into. That's what I was going to say.
Yeah, Alan, I was going to say something similar. I'm glad you brought that up because I was going to be a little bit more frank, for lack of a better term. I think it's bad storytelling. Like, if you can't, if you're expecting your audience to already know an entire universe without explaining it to them first, I think that's bad storytelling. But to Chase's point, I shouldn't have started with Dune, apparently. Apparently, I should have read the books leading up to it, which would have given me that context. So I say that kind of tongue-in-cheek, that's bad storytelling, but really it's just ignorance on my part. Chase, we've been ragging on Dune. We've been praising Dune. We've been comparing Dune to Brandon Sanderson, to Star Wars and 1960s sci-fi. I'm sure you're, as a Dune fan, I think, is it safe to say you're the biggest Dune fan here? Justin, are you an extremely big Dune fan?
No, I'm more of I think Drew. I was one step above Drew as far as I liked it a little bit more than him at first, but I was like, the gobbledygook did the goobly-gook, and I have no idea why. And so, like, for case in point, Dune 1, when Atreides is going to Arrakis, and they have that whole ceremony, and he's like, so that's done, and he's coming. I'm like, I'm barely understanding this now, seeing that movie 3 or 4 times. And this, I've seen Dune 2 twice, and I barely still understand that scene. And so it's still it is cerebral to get into it. But I liked it as far as the visuals were enough. I liked it to continue. And so that's what I'm saying. I was like maybe one step above, but definitely not a huge fan of Dune up until basically Dune 1.5, because it was like a few years after seeing Dune 1, I finally go, all right, I'll give him one more shot. Okay, you know.
Chase, any feedback? I don't know if any of this conversation has bothered you, or if we're missing something glaring, or if there's something that you'd like to add. But the floor is yours as the biggest Dune fan in this group, because I think it's fair to say that we do want to understand. Like, I love being a fan of things. Alan, obviously, biggest Star Wars. Well, what'd be fun is to do like a face-off of Alan and Justin in Star Wars fandom, like somehow like facilitate some sort of, that scene in what's that movie called, Alan? With the Star Wars fans where they Fanboys. Yeah. That
Fanboys, yeah.
I watched Fanboys for the first time based on Alan's recommendation just a few months ago. And I told you guys this in our Marco Polo chat, but like the scene that made me laugh the hardest was when they were trying to get information from some like bearded, weird, super nerd geek dude, and he's just beating the crap out of them and asking them to answer Star Wars questions. I was dying with laughter in that scene. I was like, first of all, it's hilarious. Second of all, the fact that my brother Alan knows all the answers to this is also ridiculous. And thirdly, we literally witnessed things like that actually happening in our high school, in the cafeteria where we would sit. And Justin, we got a cool story with Justin about that, and as well, where they would literally be like hypothesizing, Star Trek versus Star Wars, and like the actual science behind the science fiction. It's just fun. So it's fun to be a fan. And just like I give movies the benefit of the doubt, like I go into every movie I watch wanting to like it and giving it every opportunity that I can to give me that enjoyment. I want to be a fan of Dune. So Chase, what are your thoughts in terms of the analysis that the rest of us have discussed thus far?
So I won't say that it's out of place. Right? They're all valid points. And it grates me because I want people I care about to want to enjoy the things that I like. I had a coworker a few years ago who put it really well because he read tons of sci-fi, and him and I were talking about it and talking about Dune specifically and kind of what made Dune great and everything. And he made a really good point, which I think is really valid. So Dune is considered to science fiction what Lord of the Rings is considered for fantasy, right? It was the breaking out and mainstreaming of the fantasy genre, and Dune is the breaking out and mainstreaming of the science fiction genre. And what he pointed out to me, and I've seen this as I've been reading old science fiction, is that science fiction written pre-Dune is written for scientists. Like, you read Ray Bradbury, you read Isaac Asimov, you read, right, these old, like early 1900s science fiction books. You almost need to be an engineer, chemist, biologist to understand what's even going on. Isaac Asimov is, as I was saying, it's really dense. I mean, he's talking about psychohistorians, and you're like, I have no, like, what is this? And he's like, oh, well, they just understand people so much that they can predict the future. And but like, it's really tough. Whereas Dune, Frank Herbert was a scientist, and he's like, I'm going to try and make this mainstream where you don't have to be a scientist. Where our grandfather, who was a sheet metal salesperson, picked up Dune and loved it. It was meant for your average Joe. And so it's like there's right, you're right. It was a mainstreaming event, and it's gotten better, right? I mean, Bo, me and you probably are diehard Michael Crichton fans, and that was spectacular science fiction in the 90s with Jurassic Park and Sphere and Congo and all those great books, which are much easier to read than Dune is. But Dune was kind of the breaking out of, hey, I don't need to be an engineer to understand this book. I can be a normal person to get it. So that's again, I'm not saying anybody's points are wrong. it is kind of tough. And it's vastly different than 1990s science fiction and 2000 science fiction. But it was a huge step and a leap from previous generations of science fiction.
So what you're saying is it's the dumbed down version of science fiction for us dummies, and it's still over our heads.
Well, that hurts my feelings a little bit. Maybe I'm
Yeah.
not as smart as I thought I was. No, that's actually a really good point, Chase. I appreciate you giving us that breakdown. So far, all we've talked about is like the philosophy of the lore of Dune. Let's get into the actual movie. I'm gonna do a quick rapid fire. What do they call it? What is it?
Speed
The
round.
2 minute
Speed
round.
round. There we go. We're gonna do a quick speed round. And just rapid fire. I want each one of us, except for Chase, I want each one of us to say quickly, like in less than 30 seconds, our favorite part of the movie, Dune 2, and our least favorite part of the movie, Dune 2. Chase, if you want to try to be taking some mental notes, because I want to hear your reply to all of our favorite and least favorite components of the movie Dune 2. Oh, Justin, were you going to say something before we start that?
No, I'll go first.
Oh, cool. Perfect. Let's go. Let's start with Justin.
Okay. Definitely my favorite part of this is, and it's also my negative, is the villains make a story. And Alan definitely can attest to this. Having a very good, competent Phaedra in this made this movie. And the problem is he wasn't introduced for an hour and freaking half. If you make him the prequel and then you start Dune, I think everything works out. And then you have in the back of your mind, the antagonist is coming, and it makes the end even more epic.
Great point, Justin. Alan, favorite part, least favorite part. 30 seconds.
So I will agree with Justin that he made a great villain, and that was something that was probably lacking from the first movie and then for the first half of this movie. The biggest thing that I didn't like about it actually came with his introduction, because he jumps in the movie with his ceremonial birthday gift, and he has the armor on that was introduced in the first movie, the vibrating armor or whatever, and then he takes it off to do the fight or whatever, like as a symbolic or whatever. But then that triggered something in my mind. I was like, so for the rest of the movie, the climactic battle of the movie, why did nobody else wear their armor? That's why they don't use guns, is because guns don't penetrate through the armor that all the soldiers wear. That's why they have to do hand-to-hand combat. But none of them had it in the climactic battle. So why didn't they just use guns? That actually bothered me as like kind of a movie flaw. And I don't know if it's just like an oversight, because it was something that was like hugely established in the first movie and then slightly reinforced before the action really began in the second movie, and then completely glossed over and not even mentioned at the end. Over.
Drew, favorite part, least favorite part.
Yeah, my favorite part was the like, I've only seen it once, so I want to see it, but I felt like the first time I saw it, I understood a concise story. Obviously, the visuals were spectacular in this movie. My favorite part was the fireworks on. Does anyone really know the name of that planet? Let's be honest.
Steady Prime.
I'm pretty sure it was.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Chase, nerd. But like when that happened, I was Chase explained it really well, but in my mind, as I was watching it, I was like, wow, what a fantastical vision. What fireworks would look like on that kind of planet, like ink spot tests almost is what I was imagining. And I was like, how interesting. And then anyway, so the way that they're and then with characters from the planet, their attention to detail as they were in shadow, and Chase brought this up to me as well, while they were in shadow versus when they were in the light, and their skin would kind of be that fluorescent versus when their shoulder would be covered in a shadow, it would be more peach skin colored esque because it didn't have the effect of the sun. So all of the visuals and like the way that my favorite part, least favorite part was I just didn't, I was still felt like I was playing catch up and just didn't care enough about the characters until there was the bad guy introduced, and I was like, oh, now we've got danger afoot. Now there's a dangerous presence in the universe that we're in that we have to worry about.
Perfect. And I'm very similar to Drew in that my favorite part of the movie was the spectacle, was the visuals and the audio. Again, I saw it in IMAX, and so like my chair, I didn't buy like a D-box seat, but it felt like I did. The whole theater was rumbling with I mean, anytime there's like a loud noise, but not just loud noise, but also like neutral, like when the I mean, this is, for whatever reason, it stuck out to me because it was so early on in the movie, and I'm like, I am like, my bones are shaking in this scene, and it's incredible. It was where like all those guys with their little rocket boosters were like going up to the cliff. They were like boosting up to the cliff. Like my theater was shaking. I was like, this is incredible. Like the immersive experience. Like I said, it was a spectacle. It wasn't a normal movie. It was like something I'd never seen before. I think that's it. And that's an accurate statement. I've never seen anything like it. It was incredible. Like the closest I think would be maybe Mad Max Fury Road with Tom Hardy. That was a pretty cool movie and it had like that red desert not undertones, but tonality of the screen. I'd say that's the only movie that came close, but man, this was a spectacle. Something like it was an experience. So that was my favorite part. And I know that's kind of shallow because it has nothing to do with the story. It was just beautiful to see and hear. My least favorite part, and Chase, I mentioned this to you again in a previous conversation, but I'd like to hear your response here. Maybe you've had some time to mull it over. My least favorite part of the movie is I felt like it almost felt a little disjointed in that it was hard for me to compartmentalize in my head what was sci-fi and what was fantasy. I know we keep saying that this is a sci-fi genre, but there's like elements of witchcraft, there's mind reading, there's control, there's like, I don't know, like the whole witch story arc. They kind of lose me because I'm like, I'm all about spice and geology and planets and science. Like, give me science in the sci-fi, but this witchcraft component, it just felt out of place. It felt like it doesn't belong in the same story, and it feels like they kind of force it. They kind of shoehorn it in to places where it wouldn't flow naturally otherwise. And again, maybe this is just my ignorance with the lore, but as far as, yeah, but that opens a whole new can of worms, Justin. He just chatted Star Wars, which I get. But I wouldn't even consider, and crucify me, Alan and Justin, for saying this. I know this is super taboo, but I don't even think Star Wars is sci-fi. There's not much science behind it. It's more fantasy, if I were to label it one or the other. There's not much science. I mean, look at how there's sound in space in Star Wars. That's not scientific. That's fantasy. It's cool. I love it. Chase, I want to hear your feedback. So with all this negative, what are your responses?
So, okay. Yeah, do I just take it point by point? Yeah,
Okay,
so
before you even start, when you explain these things, I don't need names. I don't know names. Describe them in a picture.
Describe them like you would to a kindergartner.
I would like pictures, please. Please hold up a picture of each corresponding character while you describe them. Okay, go.
Okay, so the main bad guy is Big Fatty. That's Baron Harkonnen. Okay, he's the main bad guy. Then you have secondary bad guy, Dave Bautista. Okay, so he was the bad guy in the first one. Then you have skinny bad guy, who's Austin Butler.
Chase, I said describe it as though we're kindergartners, not draw it like you're a kindergartner. Listen, man, we need you to step this up. I'm doing
this on the fly.
Come on, man. This is ridiculous.
So, right. Yeah. So in the first one, right, sorry, Beast Rabin, right, who is Dave Bautista, Dave, the actor, Dave Bautista. His character's name is Rabin. So he was the main bad guy.
Drew, why are you shaking your head? Chase obviously means this guy.
Yeah,
That's what I needed.
It's little big guy. Dave Bautista.
True.
I'll use their
Try
actor's
to
name
keep up.
because that helps. So
I can't tell you how fast my brain checked out as soon as Chase said that name. I was ready to go to bed. I was like, it's impossible for me to stay in the same lane as Chase right now.
yeah. So he was like the main bad guy in the first one, but he wasn't really the bad guy, right? So in the first one, you didn't have he was the ruler of the planet and he was vicious and a brute. Like that was his character, Dave Bautista's character. And so, but he didn't have a lot of interaction with any of the main characters. And then in the second one, he's still kind of in control, but while the Fremen, the guys in the black suits, right, the desert people are like breaking the machines and disrupting their spice production, oil production, right, and stopping them from making money. And he's trying to control the desert people, and he's failing at it. And he's just this brute. And then you have Austin Butler's character, right? So skinny bad guy, knife fight bad guy, who gets to take over with the mandate of kill the leader of the desert people, who's Timothy Chalamet, right? And so yeah, skinny bad guy, but fat bad guy, right? So he's controlling everything. He just wants his nephews to figure this thing out. So yeah, so it was kind of you had to. It was really a fear of that family, the Harkonnens, the bad guy family. That's what you were supposed to do, and it's just who in there should you be afraid of, and you should be afraid of them all, and they all had their moments of fear. Yeah, Drew, go ahead.
Chase, I was just going to stop you and just reiterate what you just said. They did that so well. Once they introduced Elvis, what's his name?
Austin Butler,
which, by the way, props to him. He's really coming into his own in the past couple years. Like I wasn't a big fan at first, and after this movie, I'm like, he's very diverse, and I'm a big fan. But like what you're saying, anytime that after he was introduced, and I feel like they did a really good job introducing him, and like instilling that bad guy persona on him, that any time that they were on the screen, any one of those three, I did feel uncomfortable because it was very well known that they are not the type of bad guys that get pushed around. That they did a good job of making you fear the bad guys, which we talked about 100 times if guys make the movies. And so I just wanted to reiterate before you went, Chase, when especially when all three of them were on screen together, it was villain. It was a masterpiece for villains.
Yeah. And so I do agree with Justin that the villain makes the story, because your foil, your hero's only as good as the villain. And so having a great villain or a great set of villains just gives your hero more to overcome. So Alan, the shields, right? Their body armor, that reflective thing. You're right. They don't use it, or they use it, which is why you can't have guns or lasers, because if a laser hits a shield, it creates an atomic explosion. Like, it's bad news. So they have to resort to hand-to-hand fighting, like the knives and swords and everything. And then they had special weapons, right? The occasional like bullet that would pierce a shield, but they were designed specifically for that or whatever. And that happened, I think, 2 or 3 times. And why didn't they use it in the last? I think it was because it was a fight for the throne. So it was a fight to the death. And so you could have used shields. It just would have taken longer to do the fight.
I don't just mean the final duel between the hero and the villain. I mean, like, the entire battle when the Fremen were encroaching on the emperor's place. Like, why didn't the entire Imperial army have shields? Because that would be a huge advantage over the Fremen.
Yeah.
But They didn't. They just went into battle with them, and like, why wouldn't the Imperial Army then use guns, knowing that the
Fremen don't.
the Fremen didn't have that kind of technology to defend themselves with? Like, I think that's a pretty significant plot point that was well established in the first movie that they completely overlooked in the second one.
So there's a single line in the first movie that kind of alludes to it, but then it's in the book, and it's because shields make sandworms go crazy. It sends them into a feral rage, and so you can't have shields around a sandworm. And they because when Oscar Isaac's character goes to see how they mine spice, he mentioned something about shields, and then Liet Kynes, the black chick, who was kind of their guide, was like, you can't have shields. And so, like, again, it's a single line that's well overlooked. In the book, they describe it in several paragraphs, but a shield, if you have a shield around a sandworm, it sends them to a feral, like, whatever.
So what you're saying is, in order for this movie to make sense, I would have had to read the book. Got it.
Or listen to the single line of dialogue from the first one.
Well,
Yeah,
movie
that's
Only
like
2 hours, 45
small
minutes,
little
one line of
detail.
dialogue, 30 seconds. You missed it?
Chase, that was a beautiful explanation and a beautiful example of why fandom matters in these kind of movies. Is because all of us are like, yeah, Alan, get him, come back, let's see what we got now, Chase. And then just without skipping a, you're like, well, it's easy. If you would have read on page 5,430, paragraph 4, they made us one sentence, and we appreciate it. That's valuable information.
Yeah.
So actually, Chase, I have a question. Is what did you not like about the movie? Like, with what you know, like what are you like? That wasn't, like, they totally missed that in the book versus the film, or any of that sort. You knowing what you know, what did you not like about the movie?
Yeah. So I would say the thing, the thing that I didn't like, and it's kind of a weird thing to not like, is the stuff that they left out. But you're already 5 hours of movie to do a single book, and that's really tough to say, right? And Dennis Villanueva, or right, the director, like, how do you cut information? He had to cut one of the main characters. So there was in the first movie, there was the old white-haired kind of chubby guy who was like an advisor.
The Mentat?
Yeah. So human computer that's what they are. He didn't die in the battle. So he was alive. He was with Lady Jessica. He was with Paul throughout the entire second half of the book, and they just had to cut him for time. But there's a whole, like, subplot that happens with that. They cut out the fact that Paul and Chani had a baby, but the baby dies, and it happens kind of off page, like, just something happened, and the baby dies, and like, you're like, okay, right? And so it kind of builds that relationship between Paul and Chani even further, when, right, he goes, I love you no matter what. Like, they had a child together. And so there's a lot of stuff that they just had to cut out. And so I wouldn't say, like, those are the things that kind of bug me, but I understand that as a director, you have to cut stuff. You can't take everything in the book and put it in the movie. Otherwise, it would be, 10 hours of movie for a single 500, 600 page book. And you just can't do it. But, from a fanboy's perspective, like, I have very little to say negatively about the movie for what it did capture, from the story that it did tell. The visuals were spectacular. as you mentioned, talking about what happened on Getty Prime, that artistic choice, they used an infrared lens on the camera to capture just the light. And so when Stacy and I saw it, which was my second time seeing it, she noticed those ink blots. What you're seeing is the explosion. You're seeing the fire of a firework explode and the heat kind of signal that came off of it. And it's just like those little artistic choices where you're like, what visual person thought, hey, let's use an infrared lens on this planet with the sun that's not, or a star that's not producing yellow light, it's producing this other color of light, how that affects the environment, and just all of those like minute details that they paid really well attention to that just brought out so much of the color of the book.
Yeah, that's good to know, because I'm always worried that if I don't read the book, I'm scared of like what I've missed. But at the same time, I'm also somewhat grateful that I don't know more, because sometimes it ruins the movie. So it's good to know that there wasn't anything. It sounds like there wasn't anything that was so big that you're like, it made you disgusted with how they decided to tell the story. But another thing I was going to say is, I was refreshing in this movie, and again, like it's the book, so people who have read the book knew this was coming. But as just a guy that watches movies and loves movies, watching it was so refreshing to not see. So refreshing not see the main protagonist like cower from his responsibilities, and like he didn't make the hard choice, which is love. He didn't do that. He made the real hard choice of continuing the plan in order for him to gain power. And just like in this world of movies that we have right now, you're expecting them to just be this weak male figure. And it was nice to see this triumphant, making hard decisions, willing to take advantage of old emperor's hero. And then like the way that they built up, I thought her name was Johnny. So Chani. It was fun to see Paul and Chani's relationship grow and have them have that moment where he's like, I love you forever. And you're like, oh, that's cute. Like, that's cute, Charlie. Man, nice job. And then he comes back to it at the end and he's like, love you forever. And then he makes the hard choice. Immediately after, he lets her know, I love you forever. This is what I've got to do. This is my galactic responsibility. And he's like, Emperor, you give me your daughter's hand, and my hand and my daughter's hand, marriage. And then
Yeah,
and
I think we need more cowbell.
it worked. And so just like a point, I'm so glad that they didn't nerf the character the character Paul by making him do, what society, planet society want him to, which is give the power to Chani or something like that,
So real quick on that, that again, one of those things, reading the prequels and going into it, it's one of the parallels between his mother's life and the life that Chani was going to be, because Jessica was, she was like a concubine. Oscar Isaac's character was married before to some, house person, like that political marriage, and then she died, and so he kind of conjoined with this lady, and so that's why she wasn't the queen or the duchess. She was lady, because she was a concubine. And so it was one of those parallels between his father's life and his life, is that he had to get married for political reasons, but then he had like the love of his life, who was essentially going to become his concubine.
That's cool. That's cool to
I'd
know.
also just like to say, in this line of thinking, that you have it right. In Dune Messiah Part 3, Paul is not going to be revered as a hero. And he's actually considered, this is maybe a mild, it's not a mild spoiler. So maybe I'll just save that for later. But the things that you think are happening at the end of Dune 2 and all these things, you know, from a historic perspective, the victor goes the spoils, they write the history, but it's not necessarily good. This jihad that everybody's going on in the galaxy is that atrocity that he sees in the visions of a bunch of billions of people starving and dying. That's what he was like, I don't want to do this, I don't want to do this. And then he was kind of backed in the corner because Phaedratha is just nuking the top part of the planet. And he's like, if I don't take it, we're just going to lose anyway. So I might as well just seize the power. And because of those choices and his reluctance, Cheney was also the difference in this movie. She was just not a Paul fanboy, but she was very supportive in the book. And here they gave her the voice of reason. In the movie, they gave her the voice of reason. Like, hey, don't lose yourself, Paul, because that's what you're going to do when you have ultimate power. And so they gave her a better, more, not antagonistic, but his now confidant, and she just didn't take his crap. And I love the slap after she saves his life. It was awesome.
Skating on thin ice, Justin. When you started talking about Dune 3, I saw Drew starting to turn green, and his shirt started to rip a little bit. But then he was able to calm back down. His pulse went back to normal. Chase, I really want to hear your response to my qualm with the movie. So real quick, if you could satiate me, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, okay, so I'll do my best. I don't think there's a good satiation. I think it's how this universe basically evolved. So, right, you're 10,000 years in the future, and there was a huge war which prohibited the use of computers. And so if you don't have computers and you want to have a genetics program, how do you do it? And so Frank Herbert's kind of idea was, okay, what if we have these people who have mastered biology so well that, right, they can do things like manipulate their body composition so they can ingest poison and it doesn't kill them. They can control the gender of their offspring, and it's gotten to the point where they can even, you know, use voice modulation to control people. And that's kind of the extent of their powers. And, you know, and I might be stretching here, but I, you know, again, there's an entire book that I haven't read that talks about the backstory of them. So maybe it does go deeper into it. But for me, like, I feel like that's probably how, like how you would justify it. Right. Again, it's very science fiction. There is this kind of fantasy element with the witches. And maybe it's just, you know, me trying to take a square peg and fit it in a round hole to fit my mind frame. But that's probably the best explanation I have without reading the book that talks about their entire history and everything.
Hey, do you also think that it might be in relation, like, I feel like science fiction dogs on religion, right? I think in the secular world, religion and science can't be married together. And so when they introduce the Bene Gesserit as religion, and all the prophecies concerning Paul are like fake because they were like superimposed onto the society, like that fits into the science fiction of it. Like it's political manipulation instead of genuine religion. Maybe.
Yeah, I like that. I like both those explanations. And yeah, good point. If it's taking place 10,000 years in the future, I mean, if we can't control other people's actions with our voice modulations by that time, what the hell are we doing as a human race? You know? So absolutely, I think that that's possible. within the context of sci-fi instead of just fantasy. So yeah, great explanation, Jace. I appreciate it. Let's start wrapping this up. Final thoughts on the movie. I'll let actually let's have Drew start. Let's try to keep it under like 2 minutes, but just final assessment, overall feeling.
Yeah, big overall amazing movie. I love it. I want to see it again. I'm excited to see it again. I'm excited to watch the first and second, like in a short time frame. And they did a phenomenal job of bringing a skeptic Dune fan into the Dune fandom world, and they really sunk their teeth into me, and they're man, I hope they don't botch it with the next ones. I don't want to end on a sad note, but just on that the witchcraft part, I didn't like how, is anybody on planet Earth scared of Charlie Chalamet? Like, you picked the scrawniest, like always smirking actor to portray this like Goliath, this Messiah that's supposed to come. And anytime he used his deep voice, it still sounded chipmunky like my daughter's voice. And I was like, that's not scary, man. That's not scary. Stop what you're doing. And I'm like, come on, man. Like, I'm more scared of like the old grandma that are the is, and they use their tone than him. And like that was my, as like I really had to separate him from the character and just invest in the character in order for this to really work for me. Because like as he's starting to make these almost tyrannical decisions, I'm like starting to get invested, but there's always something in my head that's like, yeah, but it's Charlie Charlemagne. Like nobody's gonna take him serious. And I'm like, stop it. And I'd have to move that aside. And I'm like, the character of Paul, I'm fully invested in. I just that's kind of like my overall take. Love the movie, invested in the story. Hopefully we get just more investment from myself into the actor that's portraying the character moving forward.
Okay. So I think the reason why this worked, the movies worked, is because the director and the producers and everybody, not only were they they're like 90%, they're like Peter Jackson with the Lord of the Rings, as close to the source material as possible, with also making a good sit-down movie. And without their vision, you get the 1984 version. And I didn't care that I didn't understand Dune Part 1. It was still visually stunning, even if you didn't have the volume on. But then you also have the volume, like you were saying, the experience. And even, I didn't even realize this, but my dad was reading the book again, and he's like, yeah, they talk about this mumbling in the beginning of these movies. You hear that is the emperor's speech. That's how they talk or something. And Chase can tell us a little bit more about that, but that is actually from the books, that they mumble speech, whatever. And these little nods to the books are all throughout. It's visually stunning. We didn't talk enough about the cast and the supporting cast, and not just on the bad guys side. We talked about those, but I mean, Gurney Halleck and Momoa in the first one, Duncan Idaho, everybody acted the crap out of these Part 1 and Part 2, including Timothy. I actually like that, at least when he spoke, he had a deeper voice than you were cartooning. But overall, the visuals are number one. Number two, the nods to the book. And then number three, the sound effects in these movies are incredible. Another thing, real quick, the sandworms are also science fiction. So if you guys are familiar with Mark Rober, he's the rocket scientist, LES guy that does a video on YouTube for science and kids. He did a liquid sand spa and showed how you can liquefy sand. And that's what the worms are doing to move through the sand. And so you can see when it's vibrating. And so that's why they're drawn to it. So really cool visuals to see, how they liquefy the sand and go through it. And also, we didn't even talk about riding the sandworms in this movie was so epic. It like took months to do just those scenes. Like most of the movie budget was like for that kind of stuff, or as far as the personnel's. So great. And I'm looking forward that they do a part 3. And really, I hope it's Dune Messiah plus Children of Dune. Like they put those 2 books together, because Dune Messiah is just depressing to me. And I'll leave it there.
All right. So my benchmark was the 1984 version. Way better than the 1984 version. Overall, I think I agree with Bo's first assessment that it was just a really great experience overall. I feel kind of bad because it's something that I think that I probably would have enjoyed more as a teenager when I had more free time to actually like invest in it. I just couldn't get past like those opening chapters of the first book, and I was just like, I just kept giving up. And so so it's kind of like a regret. Like if I could have been immersed into the culture of it, and then had all that deep lore and knowledge kind of built up going into this, I think I would have enjoyed it more. But overall, like, yeah, it was a good time. One thing that actually kind of threw me off, actually, that we also didn't talk about, was Josh Brolin's character's return. Like when he showed up in the second movie, I was like, is this like a flashback? And arguably I didn't watch the first movie again like immediately before, so it wasn't like fresh. Like I couldn't remember if they showed him died, or if it was like implied that he died. Like I couldn't quite remember. And so when he showed back up in the second movie, I was like, where is he coming from? Glad he came back. I just, it kind of missed it. Again, this is all just a reflection on me just not being invested into the story well enough to be able to pick apart these pieces and make the connections that Chase explained to us earlier. But ultimately, I think it was a good experience. That's all I'll say.
Yeah, I kind of felt the same way, Al. It is not a very digestible movie in terms of the story, the characters, keeping track of everybody. But somehow, I wasn't like terribly bored. There were a couple times where I was like, "All right, let's move the story along. I think I'm picking up." Or, there were other times where I was like, "Should I be remembering something about this guy?" I even watched the recap before I went into the movie. Like it was just a lot. And again, it made me feel stupid watching it, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's more of an indictment on, me more than it is the movie. And especially in the context of this conversation with Chase filling us in with all the extra fandom stuff. I'm kind of torn. When I watched Lord of the Rings in the early 2000s, I was driven to the books. I was like, I want to get into this. Like, I want to know these characters inside and out. Same thing with Star Wars. Alan had an amazing collection of Star Wars comic books that were just so delicious in terms of expanding the universe and digging more into characters and doing hypotheticals. Remember that one where, like, what if the Death Star wasn't destroyed? What would happen to Princess Leia if she was still captive of Darth Vader? Like, these hypothetical alternate, storylines. Like, those are fun for me. The reason I say I'm torn is because I don't know if I'm that invested in minerals and geology. And I feel like this lore kind of revolves around that and geopolitical, who controls the spice? And I'm like, who cares? Are there lightsabers? Is somebody going to fight? Cool. Let me see the fight, that's kind of how I was. And so again, I'm torn. On the one hand, hearing Chase talk about it, I'm like, boy, that'd be fun to be that knowledgeable about Dune and then walk into these movies with that much knowledge and backstory and being able to keep up with the movie instead of expecting the movie to either pare it down or dumb it down in a way that's digestible for me individually, even though I feel like I'm probably in the majority, not the minority. But also, how about we work a little hard for our movies? We talk as movie men a lot about how movies are just getting sloppy and they're dumbed down to the lowest common denominator of intelligence. And this is now all of a sudden a movie that's like way up here and I'm complaining about it. Well, that's an indictment on me. I've got to do better as a movie man, as a fan. I want to, so So that's the dichotomy I'm feeling internally right now. On the one hand, it's boring. On the other hand, I want to know more. What do I do with those emotions? Only time will tell. Chase, we're going to let you have the final word because you are the Dune Smith. You are the encyclopedia that we've been referencing this entire discussion. So I want to hear what your thoughts are on the movie Dune 2. Just again, as kind of a bow to wrap this up.
All right, thanks. Yeah, so yeah. So my friend Matt introduced me to the books in high school, and so that's where I got. And we had talked, wouldn't it be cool if they did like a really good Dune movie? We watched the 1980s one, laughed at it. The Sci-Fi Channel tried a couple of times, and apparently, I didn't watch any of those. So watching these is kind of like one of those teenage fantasies kind of come true, where this story that I really loved, I got to see it on the big screen, and it delivered. The director said, to Justin's point, the sandworm writing, he specifically said that's going to make or break this movie. He we don't do this right, it's going to be a laughingstock. It's going to be relegated to the 1984 trash bin. But as he mentioned, the director, when he got the green light to do this movie, and people were like, "What are you going to use this? Like, how are you going to write this story?" He goes, "It's already been written. Like, it's the book." And so just look at the book. And we've talked about the times where directors do that. Zack Snyder with Watchmen. Well, how are you going to tell the story? Well, you take the graphic novel and just take frame for frame and put it on the screen. That's all you need to do. And again, he had to pare down some, but he captured a lot. There were tons of Easter eggs. It was there. There were about as many Easter eggs as there was like watching Dungeons and Dragons as a D&D player. Watching D&D was delightful. I'm like, oh yeah. And there was the same thing. There's all these little things where I'm like, oh man, they threw that in. The biggest example is in the first one, there's a bull head on the wall, and then there's a little statue of a matador. That was Oscar Isaac's dad's character, like dad in the book. It was the bull that he killed that killed him. And so, right, like all these little things where if you read, they're just giving all these nods to the fans. So I really loved that they took care of the people who loved the book. And then my biggest thing from like a cinematography perspective, I think this thing was spectacular. I read somebody's analysis, and they said, they spent so much money on the visuals to the point where you watch this movie, you can't tell that it's special effects. You can't tell that the ornithopters aren't a real thing. They looked like an actual mechanical, the helicopters, right? The little dragonfly helicopter. Just like, oh, what? Yeah, the ornithopters, right? They look like something that could actually exist. Everything in that movie looked like they actually built a working, functional machine that did what it did. And that was just the director paying tribute and saying, we want to tell a good story, and we're not going to skimp on the visuals. This has to be a visual movie to capture the intent of what Frank Herbert wrote, 60 years ago. And then I think one of my favorite things, and Bo, you touched on it, was the lingering of some of the shots. He wasn't afraid to just let you soak it in. And we kind of talked previously about how like Christopher Nolan maybe does the opposite of that. He cuts maybe sometimes a little too short, where he's trying to get to the next point, which tells a great story. But sometimes you just want to soak in the sun of this Dune planet and go, yeah, this is great. Right. This is a fictional world that none of us will ever set foot on. But man, I was there. I got to see it. And watching it in IMAX, I got, second degree burns on my face from the brightness of the screen. It was great. So, yeah, as a Dune fanboy and probably a Dune apologist, man, I absolutely loved the crap out of this movie. And yeah, I too am excited with Justin for the third installment, and hopefully, yeah, I don't know if it's been greenlit yet, but the intent was to do a trilogy, and so the first two would cover the book Dune, and then the second one would cover at a minimum Dune Messiah. So I'm excited to see where this goes. I'll have to make sure that I read the books and all the inner books and all the prequel books before that movie comes out, so that I can talk as coherently when we do a Dune Part 3 deep dive as I did in today's. So, yeah, I'm glad we all stayed hydrated with our liquid deaths or whatever for this conversation. And yeah, I appreciate the questions and the pushback. And I mean, you guys have valid points, and probably there are a lot of people out there who also have the same points. So, but overall, great movie.
Chase, that was beautiful, man. Your enthusiasm is infectious. And now I'm even more excited for the third movie. So I appreciate that, man. Cool. With that, we'll go ahead and sign off, and we will see you next week as we continue our David Fincher deep dive on our next channel. So good night, gentlemen. Thanks again for the great conversation. We'll talk next time.
Boys. Good night.
Night. Drink up.